So in this video, we're going to talk about the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands are also called the suprarenal glands because supra means above, renal means kidney. And the adrenal glands are these pyramidal-shaped organs that lie above the kidneys or atop the kidneys. Now, there are two main layers to the adrenal glands. We'll have the adrenal medulla as well as the adrenal cortex. Now, the cortex is the outermost layer of the adrenal gland because cortex means bark, like bark on a tree. And the adrenal medulla is the innermost layer of the adrenal gland because medulla means marrow, or kind of the most center. Now, the adrenal medulla is made of nervous tissue, and this is actually part of the sympathetic nervous system, whereas the adrenal cortex is made of 3 layers of glandular tissue that secrete corticosteroids. Now, the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex are the Zona glomerulosa, the Zona fasciculata, and the Zona reticularis. Now, these 3 layers are in descending order from superficial to deep. So the Zona glomerulosa would be the outermost layer of the adrenal cortex. Now, functionally, each of these layers secrete different hormones. So that the Zona glomerulosa secretes a class of hormones known as the mineralocorticoids. Zona fasciculata secretes a class of hormones known as the glucocorticoids, and Zona reticularis secretes a class of hormones known as the gonadocorticoids. Now, what we see here on this slide is a cartoon of the adrenal cortex on the left and a histology slide of the adrenal cortex on the right. Looking at this particular slide, what we see here is this space up here at the top, and you can see there's a little white space there. This is showing the edge of the tissue, which is going to be basically the outermost portion of, beyond the adrenal gland. So this would be the outside of the adrenal gland, and therefore this is the first layer of the adrenal gland, and that's going to be the capsule. So that the adrenal gland is actually going to be encased in this fibrous tissue capsule. And that deep to that capsule, that's where we get those layers of glandular tissue. So we'll have Zona glomerulosa, Zona fasciculata, and Zona reticularis. And then deep to Zona reticularis, then we'll have the renal medulla, which is made of nervous tissue. I'm sorry, not renal medulla. The adrenal medulla, which is made of nervous tissue. Now, Zona glomerulosa secretes the mineralocorticoids, which include hormones like aldosterone. So aldosterone is the most abundant of the mineralocorticoids and has the most dramatic effect in humans. The Zona fasciculata secretes the glucocorticoids, which include cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and we'll talk about this in several slides. Now, Zona reticularis secretes the gonadocorticoids, which include androgens, which are male sex hormones, and also secretes other sex hormones like female sex hormones as well. Now, deep to the adrenal cortex, we'll have the adrenal medulla down here, which is going to be the deepest layer of the adrenal gland. Again, this is nervous tissue, and that cells in the adrenal medulla release the catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine, or basically adrenaline and noradrenaline. And these are hormones of the sympathetic nervous system here in the adrenal medulla. Now, looking at this histology section, we can see that there's a couple differences between the layers of the adrenal cortex, where this layer here, Zona glomerulosa, looks distinct from this layer here, which is Zona fasciculata, and Zona reticularis even has a different sort of layered appearance to it. So just by looking at this histology section, you can see the general layers in the adrenal cortex. Now, what we see here on this slide is a table summarizing the effects of each class of adrenal hormones. So up here, up top, we're going to have the cortical hormones, the adrenal cortex hormones, and as well as the adrenal medulla hormones down below. Now remember, we had 3 main classes of adrenal cortex hormones. Those were the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the gonadocorticoids, and that these classes of hormones were released by the respective layers in the adrenal gland, or adrenal cortex. So the mineralocorticoids came from Zona glomerulosa, The glucocorticoids came from Zona fasciculata, and the gonadocorticoids came from Zona reticularis. Now, the mineralocorticoids include a large variety of different hormones, but in humans, this is going to mainly include aldosterone. So aldosterone is the most important physiologically for humans of the class of mineralocorticoids. Now, the effect of aldosterone on the body is that it's going to increase the blood levels of sodium. So it's going to have an effect on the kidneys, and it's going to allow the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium and prevent sodium loss in urine. Now, what we see here then is that when you retain sodium, you're also going to retain water because of an osmotic gradient. Remember, water follows solutes. So if you reabsorb more sodium in the kidneys, you're also going to reabsorb more water and prevent too much water loss in the kidneys. Now, ultimately, what this does is it allows you to maintain a certain blood volume as well as blood pressure, because both blood volume and blood pressure are proportional. And so if you decrease your blood volume by losing water, you're also going to decrease your blood pressure. So aldosterone helps regulate blood volume and therefore blood pressure by having the kidneys reabsorb more sodium, which allows you to retain more water. Now, the glucocorticoids are also a class of hormones that mainly include cortisol. So cortisol physiologically is the most important in humans. Now, cortisol we refer to as a stress hormone, so it'll be released during times of stress. Now, some of the effects of cortisol include promotion of gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of new glucose from fatty acids and protein, as well as hyperglycemia. So if you make new glucose, you can increase your blood glucose levels, which is hyperglycemia. Now, it's also going to lead to the breakdown of fatty acids for energy metabolism. It's going to stimulate the breakdown of protein for metabolism as well. It's going to help resist stressors to the body, so physiological stressors. And so in that sense, cortisol is a stress hormone. And over time, cortisol actually has the effect of depressing inflammatory and immune responses. And so that's why stress is associated with infection. So if you're stressed for long periods of time, you're more likely to become infected with some sort of pathogen. Because cortisol, as a stress hormone, actually depresses or inhibits both the inflammatory response and your immune response. Now, the gonadocorticoids are a class of hormones which mainly include the androgens, which are converted to like testosterone or estrogen later on. So that testosterone and estrogen don't just come from the gonads, they can also be derived from androgens released by Zona reticularis of the adrenal cortex. Some of the effects of the gonadocorticoids include contributing to the female libido or sex drive, development of pubic and axillary hair in females, and also serves as a source of estrogen following menopause in females. Now, menopause is going to be once the ovaries stop undergoing their follicular cycle, and when that happens, the ovaries stop producing estrogen, so that estrogen can still occur in the female body from these gonadocorticoids that can be converted to estrogens even after menopause. Now, the adrenal medulla, remember, is the innermost layer of the adrenal gland. Now, this is going to release the catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are involved with the sympathetic nervous system. So remember the 3 F's, fighting, flighting, and fornicating. And so that they're going to have effects that are consistent with the sympathetic nervous system response, like increased heart rate, metabolic rate, blood pressure by promoting vasoconstriction, diverting blood flow away from your digestive organs, and reverting blood flow towards other organs such as your skin and skeletal muscles. Organs that would be necessary to be most active during the fight or flight response. Now, what we see here are some of the methods by which aldosterone is stimulated to be released, we'll have primary regulators and other factors as well. For the primary regulators, aldosterone is stimulated in response to low blood volume or blood pressure. Now, the kidneys can actually measure blood volume and blood pressure, and we'll talk about how that mechanism later on in the semester. But if you do experience low blood volume and pressure, the kidneys will release a hormone called renin, and renin will lead to the production of another hormone called angiotensin II. Now, angiotensin II is what stimulates aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. And remember, aldosterone actually has an effect on the kidneys themselves to lead to the reabsorption of water, so that you can actually reabsorption of sodium, so you can actually maintain more water, hold on to more water. Now, conversely, this reabsorption of water also leads to the excretion of potassium, so that by holding on to a sodium, you can also lose a potassium into your urine. Now, ultimately what happens, though, is that aldosterone has the effect of increasing blood volume and blood pressure by allowing the kidneys to reabsorb sodium and hold on to their water. Now, some of the other factors that lead to aldosterone release include stress, and stress causes adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, to be released by the anterior pituitary. And this ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, actually stimulates the adrenal cortex, or zona glomerulosa, to release aldosterone. Now, over here, what we see is not an effect that leads to the release of aldosterone, but rather the inhibition of aldosterone. Remember that aldosterone leads to an increase in blood pressure and blood volume. Therefore, if our blood pressure and blood volume were high, you'd want to inhibit aldosterone from being released. And the way this works is that in the heart, there are receptors that can sense blood pressure, and these are called baroreceptors. Now, if your blood pressure or blood volume is too high, the heart can release a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. Now, atrial natriuretic peptide actually inhibits cells in the zona glomerulosa from releasing aldosterone, and ultimately this allows you to keep your blood pressure from getting too high. So if you remember, we talked about how the glucocorticoids were released from zona fasciculata, and they mainly include cortisol, which is also called hydrocortisone. Now, the effects of cortisol, they're going to help keep blood glucose levels relatively constant. It's going to help maintain blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors, or basically constricting your blood vessels to keep your blood pressure up. Some other hormones that include the glucocorticoids would include cortisone and corticosterone. These ones aren't found in significant concentration in humans. Really, when we talk about the glucocorticoids, in humans, we're really referring to cortisol. Now, the effects of cortisol are varied, and cortisol will be stimulated to be released also by ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. So if you remember, adrenocorticotropic hormone can stimulate the release of aldosterone, but also stimulates the release of cortisol from zona fasciculata. Now, what happens too is that cortisol is going to have the effect of creating new glucose, which is gluconeogenesis. So gluco means glucose, neo is new, genesis means to create. So cortisol stimulates the formation of new glucose through this process called gluconeogenesis. This is going to occur primarily in the liver, where fats and proteins can be converted into glucose. Now, ultimately what this does is it's going to cause an increase in blood glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. And by creating new glucose and releasing some of the fatty acids and amino acids from your body's stores, this helps save glucose for the brain, because the brain can only run on glucose. So that if you can release fatty acids and amino acids for other cells, there's glucose left over for your brain to use. Now, cortisol, like we talked about in the previous slide, also enhances vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction is going to be the constriction of blood vessels, where the lumen of a blood vessel will get smaller. Ultimately, what this does is it causes blood pressure to rise, and the effect of this is that it helps distribute nutrients to cells more quickly. Now, we do get some different imbalances that can occur from the glucocorticoids. So if you have too much glucocorticoid secretion, like too much cortisol secretion, you can get a disease called Cushing syndrome. Now, Cushing syndrome is due to hypersecretion of cortisol. And with this particular disease, what we see is depressed cartilage and bone formation. So you get brittle tissues around your body, including cartilage and bone. It's going to help inhibit inflammation and also depress the immune system, so that individuals with Cushing disease will be more susceptible to infection or more prone to infection. Now, hypersecretion of cortisol also leads to disruption of the cardiovascular, neural, and digestive system or gastrointestinal system. Now, Addison's disease is pretty much the opposite of Cushing's disease, where we get a hyposecretion or not enough cortisol in somebody's body. So Addison's disease is due to a lack of cortisol. Now, what we see then is that it's often going to also include deficits in the mineralocorticoids, so that what you see is a decrease in glucose and sodium levels, and we also see weight loss, severe dehydration, and low blood pressure or hypotension as a result of Addison's disease as well. Now, the gonadocorticoids are the class of hormones released by Zona reticularis, and these are the most weak of the androgens. So that means that the sex hormones that are released by the gonads are stronger, but you can have sex hormones released by your adrenal cortex, but they're just a little bit more weak. So that the gonadocorticoids or androgens that are secreted by Zona reticularis are converted to testosterone in different cells. Some of those androgens can be converted to estrogen as well. Now, functionally, it's believed that these gonadocorticoids contribute to the onset of puberty. They also have an effect on secondary sex characteristics, such as, body hair in males, breast formation in females. The gonadocorticoids also are involved with sex drive in women, or libido, as well as the source of estrogen in women who've already undergone menopause, where after menopause, the ovaries stop making estrogen, so that estrogens need to then come from the adrenal cortex instead. So the adrenal medulla is the deepest layer in the adrenal gland, and so that's going to have neural cells called medullary chromaffin cells. These are actually like a specialized type of neuron. And now these chromaffin cells, they secrete catecholamines, including epinephrine and norepinephrine. In fact, most of the catecholamines secreted by the adrenal medulla are epinephrine, it's about 80%, and the rest are norepinephrine. Now, if you remember, epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, are the primary hormones of the sympathetic nervous system. And so then you'd expect the sympathetic nervous system response in response to the release of these hormones. So that some of the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine would be like vasoconstriction, which is going to increase blood pressure. It's going to have an increase on heart rate due to the effect of beta-1 receptors on the heart. It's going to also increase blood glucose levels and lead to the diversion of blood to different tissues, including like the brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. Now, what we're going to see here in this slide is a comparison of short-term versus long-term stress. So we talked about how cortisol is a stress hormone, and that's true for like prolonged stress. But we also know that the sympathetic nervous system is most active during the initial stress response, right? During fight or flight response. So that the way that your body responds initially due to short-term stress is that we'll have nerve impulses from the brain that reach the spinal cord. They're going to activate a preganglionic nerve fiber in the sympathetic nervous system, which then causes neural cells here in the adrenal medulla to release their catecholamines, or hormones, including epinephrine and norepinephrine, so that these hormones will travel through the bloodstream and then have various effects like increasing heart rate, blood pressure, leading to bronchodilation. We'll talk about that later on the semester. It's going to help lead to the increase of glucose in your bloodstream. It's going to change blood flow away from your digestive organs and toward like your brain and skeletal muscle. And it's going to also increase your metabolic rate. So these are some of the short-term responses to stress. Now the long-term responses to stress, or prolonged stress, are going to involve, still the catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine, but they're also going to include some of the mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. So that prolonged stress leads to the release of corticotropic releasing hormone by the hypothalamus, and that hormone causes the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, by the anterior pituitary, where that ACTH travels through the bloodstream and then stimulates cells, glandular cells in the adrenal cortex to release mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. So that with prolonged stress, we see severely elevated mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Now, ultimately, what this does is going to cause your body to retain more sodium and water, and ultimately increase blood volume and blood pressure as a result. Now, we're also going to see, as a result of the glucocorticoids, that proteins and fats will be converted to glucose. So you're going to see a rise in blood glucose concentration. But you're also going to see a suppression of the immune system with prolonged stress. So when you think about stress in the long term, it actually can have an inhibitory function on your immune system, which can lead you to be more susceptible to infectious diseases.